On behalf of my colleagues in the St. Lawrence Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, I welcome you to the 30th Annual Gould Discourse. The Discourse, a Friday night tradition at the St. Lawrence District Assembly since its inception, honors Josephine Gould. A leader in the professionalization of religious education, Ms. Gould served both of our congregations in Syracuse and was a founding member of LREDA, the Liberal Religious Education Directors Association. I'm looking at Debbie. This year's discoursant, the Reverend Douglas Taylor, was selected by past presenters in accordance with the tradition of the Gould Discourse. The Reverend Douglas Taylor is a fourth-generation Universalist. He grew up in the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York, where, when he was 1 year old, the Reverend Dick Gilbert officiated at his dedication, and where, when he was 13 years old, his mother, the Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Strong, was ordained as Minister of Religious Education. Douglas is a graduate of Meadville Lombard Theological School and was ordained by May Memorial Unitarian Universalist Society in Syracuse in 1999. In 2003, Douglas was called by the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Binghamton, New York, where he has faithfully served for these past 10 years. In addition to his association with the Binghamton congregation, he is a member of the board of the American Civic Association and an active member of the Children of Abraham Interfaith Group. Douglas is co-leader of the Spiritual Deepening Advisory Council of the St. Lawrence District and the district's representative to the ULTI, that's the UU Leadership Training Institute. He's been the district's representative to the ULTI Planning Design Team. ULTI has been described as transformational by many of those who have participated, and Douglas has helped to make it so, both as planner and presenter. In the recent past, Douglas has served our UUMA, our ministers chapter, as center representative, as president, and as lead guitarist. Selected meditations, sermons, and essays of his have been included in a variety of publications. Douglas was the Jean Blank Memorial Speaker for the Silver Bay Conference in 2007. And this year in June, on Father's Day, he will be the guest minister at the annual pilgrimage to Barneveld. If you haven't done that, do it. He and his wife, Cedra, have 3 amazing and talented children, and Douglas has a vast array of very interesting socks. Following his comments, Douglas has invited the Reverend Priscilla Richter, who also has an interesting collection of colorful socks, to respond. Dear people, it is my honor and my privilege to present my esteemed and beloved colleague, the Reverend Douglas Taylor. He's saying no, the Reverend Douglas Taylor.
You look good. Let me begin in the middle with the pine trees, because I'm pretty sure that's the interesting part. This begins with a story about John Muir, the great naturalist from the late 1800s. He is the father of our national parks, the founder of the Sierra Club. Muir might also be called the progenitor of modern extreme sports. Really, he was a bit of a thrill seeker. He was born in Scotland in 1834, and one of the stories that I read is that he and his brother David would dare each other to do dangerous things. They called them scoochers. And they would, for example, climb out the second-story window of their bedroom and hang by one hand, and then dare the other one to do it. And then when the other one would climb out, they would do that and hang by only two fingers. That was a scoocher. And one time, John Muir climbed out of the window, all the way out, and went up onto the peaked top in a great windy storm, and he called it a capital scoocher. He was out there, and the wind was blowing, and he thought it was exhilarating, and he loved the view. His brother, who followed after, was quite unnerved by the experience of being out there in the wind on the peaked roof of their house. And young John called out to him saying, "Don't shout for help, because if Father comes, we'll both be in serious trouble." And so John actually helped him back into the house, and his brother David decided to give up trying to follow John on any more of those dangerous dares. But that is not the story that I wanted to tell you. That just sets the stage, like foreshadowing. The story I want to share is from later in John Muir's life, about 30 years. It is in his journal, A Windstorm in the Forests, it's titled. He wrote this: "One of the most beautiful and exhilarating storms I ever enjoyed in the Sierra occurred in December of 1794, when I happened to be exploring one of the tributary valleys of the Yuba River. He was on his way to see a friend that day, but then he noticed the fine windstorm that was brewing, and he decided instead to head out into the woods, that he might enjoy it." Now, I don't know about you, but when I see a big windstorm coming, I have no intention of going out into the woods. I would much prefer to go into shelter, but John Muir is led by a different impulse. "For on such occasions," he wrote, "nature has always something rare to show us, and the danger to life and limb is hardly greater than one would experience crouching depreciatingly under a roof." Well, after spending a good while walking around in the woods in the midst of this great windstorm, it occurred to him that it would be a fine thing to climb one of the trees and obtain a wider outlook. And so he hunted for a choice tree to climb, and he eventually found a tall copse of Douglas spruces growing close together. And he knew that in a windstorm of this nature, it was possible for the wind to blow down and completely uproot a tree. But a dozen or so trees standing together would serve as protection for each of the trees in the copse. Though comparatively young, he writes in his journal, they were about 100 feet high, and their lithe, brushy tops were rocking and swirling in the wild ecstasy. Being accustomed to climb trees and making botanical studies, I experienced no difficulty in reaching the top of this one, and never before did I enjoy so noble an exhilaration of motion. He clung to that high, slender tree as it bent and swirled in the storm. The tree bent from 20 to 30 degrees in arc, but he trusted the companions stand around him to keep his tree rooted and upright throughout the experience. He describes it as exciting and as beautiful. He felt the wind in his pulse. Can you imagine it? He described light and wind sweeping across the open valley in front of him, before his eyes, and he saw that it was very much like the waves on an ocean, the way that the line of wind would undulate, and that the way that the trees would swirl in circles. I kept my lofty perch for hours, he writes, frequently closing my eyes to enjoy the music by itself, or to feast quietly on the delicious fragrance that was streaming past. This experience was a seminal moment for Muir's sense of connectedness with all nature. We are all travelers, he wrote, travelers of the Milky Way together, trees and men. But it never occurred to me until this storm day, while swinging in the wind, that trees are travelers in the ordinary sense. They make many journeys, not extensive ones, it is true, he wrote, but our own little journeys away and back again are only little more than tree wavings, many of them not so much. Why have I told you this story? I use this story as a parable to offer up a religious point. People will often use the word parable to mean exclusively those stories told by Jesus in the Christian scriptures. As a Unitarian Universalist, I take a broader view of what counts as scripture and thus also of what is allowably called a parable. One of the wonderful aspects of any parable is the way in which it can be read both narrowly and literally, or it can be read broadly and metaphorically. Both perspectives can uncover a good religious message. The parable, for example, of the prodigal son, narrowly understood, tells us that we can go home again, and that forgiveness among family members is a good thing. But a good parable will often have layers of meaning. The story of the prodigal son can also tell us about the nature of God and about ourselves. And you may argue with the theology, but the lesson that God is like a forgiving parent is a great story. Perhaps you're not interested in exploring the parables of the Christian scriptures. Perhaps as a Unitarian Universalist, you are happily released from trying to make meaning from these old stories, and certainly you are free to arrive to that conclusion. At our core, theologically, Unitarian Universalists have long held fast to the freedom of conscience. We have a deep commitment to individual experience as the arbiter of truth and meaning. Faith cannot be coerced. It starts here, in the heart of each person. This, of course, is not a freedom to believe anything that we want. It is a commitment to allow each of us to believe as we must, by the light of conscience that is dictated from within. Our theological center is not in a set doctrine or creed, but rather in our covenant, our pledge to help each other in the search for what is ultimately meaningful in life. So what I present this hour is my offering of support to you, and in no small way to myself, to continue that search. A wise colleague once said that we ministers are called to meet people where they are, but we are under no obligation to leave them there. But all that is background to my present point. In looking at this story of John Muir and the swaying pine tree, we find literal and narrow lessons that are valid and true. We can learn that there are certain trees and groups of trees that you can climb in a windstorm and trust to not blow over. We can learn that the natural world is alive and that you are part of this great interconnected web of existence. John Muir said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. this interconnectedness that we often speak of as Unitarian Universalists, is a literal fact. A good parable can show you, through a literal and narrow interpretation, valuable insights into living. But there is more. For those who are willing to sink deeper, there are deeper religious lessons to be found, and really that is what I want to unfold for you this evening. I want to tell you about spirit and faith from a Unitarian Universalist perspective. I want to shine a light on the movement of the Spirit in our lives. Let me offer two possible interpretations derived from a metaphorical and broader interpretation of the John Muir story that I use as a parable. One interpretation is theological and the other is ecclesiological. First, perhaps we can talk of God through this story. Too often, as Unitarian Universalists, our conversations about the word God get caught up in what we do not believe and what we do not accept. May I gently suggest that this is a fine starting point, but an insufficient place to stop. And in terms of the concept of the holy, the all, the spirit of life and love, perhaps we can speak of God as the wind that blows through the trees. Or perhaps we can speak of God as a tree that we cling to when the storms of life blow over us. Too often I find poems and scripture verses and songs about the image of God as a rock that we cling to for support in our storms. What if we could speak of God not as an inert, static, lifeless rock, but as a tree? What if the image were of something alive, even something alive with us? Peter Mayer is the songwriter who wrote the lyrics for that now widely popular hymn, Blue Boat Home. How many of you, just out of curiosity, sang that song last week? Okay, a few of you. Okay, it was Earth Day. Peter Mayer has another song that I want to tell you about called God is a River, that carries the same imagery that the tree in the windstorm offers, but it uses a river metaphor in the same way that I'm suggesting John Muir's tree can be interpreted. In the ever-shifting waters of the river of this life, I was swimming, seeking comfort. I was wrestling waves to find a boulder I could cling to, a stone to hold me fast, where I might let the fretful waters of this river round me pass. And so I found an anchor, a blessed resting place, a trusty rock I called my Savior, for there I would be safe. From the river and its dangers I proclaimed my rock divine, and I prayed to it, protect me. And the rock replied, God is a river, not just a stone. God is a wild raging rapids and a slow meandering flow. God is a deep and narrow passage, a peaceful sandy shore. God is a river swimmer, so let go. 2 years ago, we invited Peter Mayer to come visit us in Binghamton, New York, and I had the pleasure of sharing the Sunday worship with him, and I asked him to sing this song, God is a River, as a companion to the story I shared about John Muir strapping himself to the top of a pine tree to experience the storm, and the song and the layer of interpretation I put on the story offered up a compelling, fresh image of God that is very much in line with process theology. You see, I wove it back. I knew some of you were tracking by the title and all that. What if, in the most troubling times of your life, you could imagine your refuge and your security not found in the stability, but in the freedom to bend and sway? Have you ever felt swept under by the storm? Have you ever felt scattered, lost, broken, cut off? When the storm of life blows over you, can you bow and bend like a bamboo reed rather than hunker down and hide? In a chapter of the Tao Te Ching we read, "A tree that is unbending is easily broken. The hard and strong will fall. The soft and yielding will overcome." The reed is a natural example of how to hold fast with conviction and commitment to ever remain in place through the strongest of winds. We can be as tenacious as the reed. This valuable lesson is echoed in the story of John Muir and the swaying pine trees. But more amazing still is the suggestion Peter Mayer offers in his song that I dare to offer in my interpretation of John Muir's story. We can see God as a bending reed, as a river, as a swaying pine, not simply as a living element of nature, but also as the living strength in which we can rest our faith. What I am describing is generally understood as process theology. Process theology starts with Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher who founded this school of thought. Whitehead was an English mathematician and a philosopher from the late 1800s through the mid-1900s, and he wrote books which set the groundwork for modern mathematical philosophy and logic. The philosophical ground of what we now know as process theology arises from Whitehead's response to Einstein and quantum physics. I won't go into the details of that. I can't go into the details of that. But the crux of the idea is this. In quantum physics, we see that everything is in motion. We discover that nothing is fixed, that everything is moving. Atoms, those tiny things that we considered the basic building blocks of everything, are not simply little building blocks. They have subparts, and those parts are spinning and vibrating and changing. Everything that seems solid, fixed, and stable is in fact in dynamic motion. The electrons of an atom are not even little balls orbiting the nucleus, as I was taught in high school. The models that I was offered in school looked very similar to those of the astronomical figures out in space. The small planet with a moon orbiting around it was the image that I was offered in high school of what an atom is like, the nucleus and the electrons swirling around. By college, I was learning about an electron field because it wasn't accurate to say that it was orbiting. It was doing something else. I won't go into the details. I can't go into the details. The point is this. Everything we thought was fixed, stable, solid, turns out to be vibrating, changing, shifting. Whitehead saw this and figured This applied not only to the physical world, but to the metaphysical world as well. And he came up with a philosophy that trusted becoming over being. He talked about events as the discrete base of reality rather than matter. And he really messed with our sense of time and reality. And a simplified version of what Whitehead seemed to be saying is, if it seems static, don't trust it. This is a remarkable sentiment when applied to religion. Back when scientists proposed that the earth could be moving through space, the church countered, citing Psalm 104, to say that God set the earth on its foundations, it can never be moved. And Job 28, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Who laid its cornerstone? The church dismissed the notion that the physical world was in constant motion, not simply because it contradicted what Scripture said about the physical world, but also for the implication it held for the nature of all existence, even of God who set those foundations of all existence according to that traditional theology. Foundations, ideals, traditions are generally thought of as stable, as static, as secure. Certainly in Western philosophy and in Christian theology, we want truth to be unchanging. Our deepest values ought to be unchanging. There ought to be some firm ground on which we stand, metaphorically speaking. But when the literal firm ground on which we stand is made up of moving, vibrating atoms, then perhaps the metaphorical ground that we stand on is also shifting, not because we're wrong or because we have selected unstable ground, simply because that is now the nature of ground. By this theology, and in my understanding of the nature of God, we're not talking about a traditional concept of God. We're not talking about a being, a person, a creature that looks a little bit like you and me, maybe with a beard and a thunderbolt. No. No. I have heard the arguments against using the word God in Unitarian Universalist circles. Why make up new definitions for the old words? But I respond that we don't need to cede the definitions to the fundamentalists. I understand that when I say God, other people who hear may think I mean something that I know, and you know I don't mean. And in case you're tracking the talk, this is the part where I talk about how we tangle with some problems of epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do we know what the word God means? But consider this, if I were to say the word red, do you think that everyone in this room will have conjured up the exact shade of red that I had in mind when I said the word? Earlier this month I was preaching and I mentioned our Standing on the Side of Love banner, and I called it orange. 3 people came up to me and said, "Oh, I thought it was yellow." What color is the hymnal supplement? The Singing the Journey? Aqua? Blue-green? Turquoise? Teal? Luckily, we have examples of the colors, and we can just pick up the hymnal and say, this color, this is what I mean. That banner, the color of that banner, that's the color I mean. Perhaps with God, the best we can do is describe an experience and say, that's what I mean. Or consider from another angle, can we allow the words of spirit and faith to evolve. This is another way to address the statement that we should not be using these old words. Perhaps we can allow the words of spirit and faith to evolve as we have allowed other words in our understanding to grow. For example, we still use the word planet, even though it literally means wanderer. And we know the planets don't wander. And we can even still be a little bitter about Pluto's demotion. But we must acknowledge that our understanding of the word planet is allowed to change as our understanding about the nature of planet grows and changes. And so too can our understanding of the word God change as we understand more about the nature of God. God is a name given for that dynamic source of your living, for the creative energy in everything, for the whole of which you are a part. This is perhaps a little vague, but then the trouble with God really began when people started speaking of God as a literal character and a literal story. Cast away all literal interpretations of the nature of God. They are all illogical and irrational. Seek instead the source of your living. Seek the creative spark that flows around you and through you. Seek the whole of which you are a part. If it seems static, don't trust it. Seek instead the movement of the Spirit. And this talking about the Spirit leads me to my second interpretation. My first interpretation from that story was theological. My second interpretation is grounded in ecclesiology. And for that I turn to the work of James Luther Adams, Unitarian theologian who described the free church as a body of believers freely joined in a covenant of loyalty to the Holy Spirit of love. He said the free church is governed by its own members, with the reign of the Spirit of love among those members. In the reading that we have by him in our hymnal, number 591, if you're taking notes, Adams begins with theology. He says, I call that church free, which enters into covenant with the ultimate source of existence, that sustaining and transforming power not made by human hands. This reading clarifies the theological and covenantal nature of our gathered religious communities, our ecclesiology. To state our polity, we first state our theology. This is something that we have let slip as Unitarian Universalists lately. But Adams said, I call that church free which brings individuals into a caring, trusting fellowship. And he goes on to describe it as a pilgrim church, a servant church on the adventure of the Spirit. And then he closes quoting Scripture, saying, its aim to find unity and diversity under the promptings of the Spirit that bloweth where it listeth and maketh all things free. John Muir clung to the top of that tall pine tree to feel the wind blow where it will. It is not an insignificant piece of the story that the tree that Muir discovered to be good and a safe choice was because it was in a copse of trees, a community of trees supporting each other. Or to read it metaphorically, a gathering of individuals in a caring and trusting fellowship. For our theology of the Spirit to be made real in the world, it is best enacted in community. It starts here in the heart of each individual, but it can't stay here. The Spirit must move. The wind sings four-part harmony, aspen, pinyon, ponderosa, and spruce is the opening line of an Elizabeth Tarbox's meditation entitled Pine Forest Fugue. She goes on to say what language this is, beyond the reach of words. This language of the trees in the wind, Tarbox talks about in that meditation, reminds me of the experience that Muir had in the Sierra, when he understood the trees as living organisms, travelers of the Milky Way, he said, as much as we, but it's hard to put into words. Sometimes trying to understand each other is like listening to what Tarbox calls the theme of 1,000 pines. Have you ever experienced what Tarbox describes, but in reference to our religious communities? Instead of a community of the forest, I listen and I hear you, like the aspen, the pinyon, the ponderosa, and the spruce. We each speak from our own understanding, from our own experience. We hope for a harmony of voices in our congregations, but we each have more in our living than can be expressed with words. We each know more of love and of spirit than we can express in common discourse together, and yet we are together. And this is more than academic for me. It's more than clever theological debate or semantic trick. I have had experiences that have led me to believe that my prayers do make a difference and that grace is real. Yet I stumble in an effort to reach beyond the words that fail me. I trust our covenanted communities and am committed to their health and their enrichment, but I am the kind of person who desperately needs a theological framework to hold it all. I see God as a dynamic spirit, luring the best out of me, luring the best out of us as people. I have felt the Spirit flowing through me, and I have nurtured my relationships with the Spirit through the care of my faith community. The real reason I am so fascinated by process theology is personal. I have had experiences of grace and the power of the Spirit that I am still trying to understand. Here now a two-part story from my own experience. The first part of this story is the last chapter of the life of Roland Austin. Roland was a member of the Binghamton congregation who died in 2009. The story I want to tell you is about the last day he came to church. It was the first Sunday of April. The youth were leading the worship service. His wife drove up the front circle just outside the door to let him out before she went and parked the car. But Roland was not able to make it the dozen or so feet from the car to the door and ended up being taken away in an ambulance that we had to call. He was taken to the emergency room, which is where I visited him later that afternoon. Roland was one of the staunch peace activists in our congregation. A gentle soul through and through. Roland was a conscientious objector in World War II, and that was a hard war to object to. Roland was one of the people who traveled to Russia during the last years of the Cold War, establishing relationships and witnessing for peace. Roland was a well-loved and respected member of the congregation, and his fading health was painful for us all. And I went into the emergency room that afternoon, and I saw that his wife was talking on her cell phone, probably to one of the kids. And I nodded to her, and I circled around to Roland, where he lay sleeping on the hospital ER bed, and I bowed my head, about to offer up a prayer, when his eyes fluttered open, and he said, "Oh, They're standing over me. And his eyes focused, and he said, You're standing over me. And I smiled at him, and I said hello, and he smiled back, and I asked him how he was feeling. What he said next has been echoing in my soul ever since. He said, It's pouring out of you and into me, and I feel really good. It was several weeks later that Roland died peacefully at home. That moment of prayer in the hospital with him has come to be a turning point in my faith and in my ministry. Now, I don't know what Roland experienced. I don't know who he sensed standing over him before he saw me standing at his bedside. I don't know how Roland would have named what he said was pouring out of me and into him. Was it energy? Was it God or angels? Perhaps Roland experienced what was pouring into him as prayer, as healing power, as love. I can't answer for Roland. And truly, this point is implicitly at the center of our Unitarian Universalist gatherings every time we come together. I can't tell you your answers. Yet we each have experiences that lead us deeper. Truly, this is the heart of why we are covenanting communities of faith rather than people of a creed. It starts here in every person's heart and understanding. It starts here, but it can't stay here. This is a two-part story. The events of my encounter with Roland happened within the context of a very difficult and significant weekend in Binghamton, New York. That Sunday was preceded by a Friday. Roland's last Sunday morning was April 5th, and on April 3rd of 2009, in the morning, a man entered the American Civic Association and opened fire on people studying to become citizens. He killed 13 people before taking his own life. I heard about this on the news on that Friday, and later that evening, after the police and the emergency responders had the situation in hand, I received a call from the mayor's office asking me to come in and sit down with other local clergy Saturday morning to talk about how we would respond. We decided to host a community-wide memorial service at one of the high schools on Sunday evening. The school was a neutral and non-religious space, and it was large enough to hold the number of people we anticipated would show up. I ended up as one of the lead organizers of the service for two reasons, perhaps. One, I'm not able to keep my mouth shut in situations like that. And two, because I knew more than one name for God. Meaning I am comfortable and competent weaving different theological needs into a single worship service. That's what we do nearly every week in our Unitarian Universalist houses of worship. The dead and their families were from Pakistan and Iraq, Vietnam and China, Haiti, Brazil, the Philippines, and the Ukraine. They were Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Orthodox Christian, and Catholic. The American Civic Association helped us arrange for translators to make the words spoken by those we English-speaking clergy accessible in two other languages. We pulled together clergy to speak and read from as many of these religious traditions as possible. We found a few people to offer music, including my daughter, who played harp. I remember she was nervous, and we didn't tell her that the service was being broadcast live to tens of thousands of people around the greater Binghamton area. She thought she was only playing to the 1,500 gathered in the room. My role in the service was to read the announcements leading into the event and to offer the opening prayer. After my part, I sat down and listened. As I sat there listening to my clergy friends offering their prayers, as I listened to the hurt and the anguish and the loss and the anger and the cry for healing, I remembered what Roland had said to me a few hours earlier that Sunday afternoon when I had visited him in the emergency room. It had only been 3 hours earlier that Roland had looked me in the eye, saying, "It's pouring out of you and into me, and I feel really good." So I took a deep breath, and I imagined myself opening up and pouring out what was needed by these people in the room with me. I imagined it as healing energy. I thought of it as a prayer. I considered my actions and my intentions to be that of a vessel through which God's love might pour out. That's what I saw they needed. God's love and healing comfort. So that's what I aimed to give them. Now, I have no way of knowing what everyone else experienced in the room, or if they had any sense of spirit or healing moving through them and around them that I was trying to channel. I don't know. Here's what I do know. I was exhausted for the rest of the week. I could barely move. I was exhausted in the sense that the etymology of the word exhaust is in Latin. It's to draw off, to use up, to take away, literally to draw off water. I felt drained. I went through the motions for the next few weeks. I felt I was drained and I was empty until later that month when I arrived among my Unitarian Universalist ministerial and religious education colleagues at our district spring gathering. Many of these colleagues had called me in the days and weeks after the shooting, and many had written to me cards and emails. But gathering there with them, finally, weeks later, being in the room with them, seeing their faces, touching their hands, I was finally able to let go and receive their support. I told them my story. I cried, and they held me, and they prayed with me, and I received the rest and the relief that I needed to begin to recharge. I was cradled in the four-part harmony of my forest. I was holding fast to my pine as it swayed in the wind. I was awash with the whispers of the Spirit. I was held in the loving arms of God. God was no rock for me. God was my living, dynamic tree that bent when I bent, moved when I moved, bowed when I bowed, wept when I wept, and was still when I was still. You may not agree with my theology or with my interpretation of these stories, but you don't need to. Your experiences should lead you to your own interpretations, your own theological understanding. But we each can witness to what we know. How has it been for you? What are your experiences of spirit and of mystery? Poet Gregory Orr writes, "Grief will come to you. Grip and cling all you want. It makes no difference. Catastrophe is just waiting to happen. Loss, you can be certain of it. Flow and swirl of the world, carried along as if by a dark current. All you can do is keep swimming. All you can do is keep singing." So what is your song? What metaphors do you use? How do you describe the movement of the Spirit in your life? This is what I know. There is a Spirit, an energy, a movement that stirs within by whatever name you name it. It is the base inheritance of every one of us. Thus we have declared as Unitarian Universalists throughout our history, it starts here within each of us. It starts here, but it can't stay here. As Unitarian Universalists, we have long concluded that we need not think alike to love alike, that so long as we agree in love, no disagreement can do us any harm. That agreement is not our goal. What I am saying is only what has always been said at our center. It starts here, in the heart of every person. It starts here, but it can't stay here. It must move. In my experience, God is that creative and transformative power in my life. Ever new, ever leading me to put my faith and trust in the beckoning future. I believe God is the Spirit of life and love, the creative energy found in all of existence. God is that transformative power of love that lures us to be better people, building a better world. God is a loving, dynamic Spirit. God is a river, not just a stone. God is a wild, raging rapid and a slow, meandering flow. God is a deep and narrow passage, a peaceful, sandy shoal. God is a river swimmer, so let go. And regardless of how storm-tossed we may feel, may we stay open to the movement of the Spirit. Regardless of the many ways we feel scattered, or lost, or broken, or cut off, may we learn to trust the deep connection tying us to all, binding our troubled lives into a community of truth and spirit, regardless of the evidence presented to us every day that we are alienated and alone. May we have faith to trust the Spirit. It starts here, in the heart of every one of us. It starts here, but it can't stay here. The Spirit must move. And may we learn to let go enough to heed the call and follow the lure of the Spirit, to become the free people we long to be, free to bend, free to live, free to build the better world. In a world without end, may it be so.
Douglas, what an inspiring, powerful, and thought-provoking talk. Thank you so much for all that you pulled together here in a moving and compelling way. Your John Muir parable leaves me breathless. I too find holiness, God, if you will, in the connectedness of nature, but better with my feet planted firmly on terra firma. Swaying 100 feet up in a treetop during a big windstorm, no matter how connected that tree might be to its own community, leaves me queasy. I am not a scoocher. I'm impressed at how you pulled some important things together. How, for Unitarian Universalists, personal experience is at the root of our spiritual and religious understanding. That a core universal truth is that we are all intertwined and connected with all life. And quantum reality, that all is in constant motion. This is evolution, and it is not static indeed. Process theology. We are not only part of this unfolding reality, but important players in its very evolution, co-creating with all life. And in this connectedness, we Unitarian Universalists, like those Douglas spruces, do not do this alone, but in our religious communities to keep the movement of the Spirit flowing among us. Your stories, not only the Muir parable, but your heartfelt personal stories as well, deftly bring forth these concepts in a way that give us some big questions to wrestle with. Like, how do we language our personal experience, how the Spirit moves among us? I don't think we talk about these things as much as we need to. We tiptoe around the God talk. I believe I'm not the only minister among us who tries to think of new euphemisms for a wider and bigger God than the mean old man in the sky who gives and withholds love and justice in a capricious manner. We know what we reject. We deconstruct what doesn't work for us. But we shy away from the work of reframing and reconstructing these concepts. The First Unitarian Society of Schenectady, which I serve, has this year engaged with the Reverend Dr. Tandayaka, a UU minister and scholar, who leads a program entitled We Love Beyond Belief. One of the things that she has taught us is how to reframe the sacred in ways that work for us, even in our various theological orientations. This is important work. What are we afraid of? And doesn't our covenant, that foundational basis around which we organize as Unitarian Universalists, that James Luther Adams so wonderfully lifted up for us in the 20th century, isn't that the basis through which we can move through that fear? Another question: how do we embrace both those with a more mystical orientation and those among us with a more rational orientation? By mystical, I don't mean monks or saints. I mean deeply connecting with what we find most holy: spirit, mystery, nature, each other. And by rational, I mean relying more on reason, logic, fact. Muir and Whitehead were both boundary crossers, bridging the scientific and natural and mathematical worlds with that realm of spirituality. They both spoke languages in a world, they both bridged those, spoke both languages that serve as a bridge in a world that often pit science and religion against each other. We Unitarian Universalists have evolved from both strands. The mystical, most notably from our transcendentalist influences, and the rational strands from our heritage of reason and our humanist evolutions. We are both and, not either or. Both mystic folks and rational folks love and serve and share our broad UU values. We may language all of this differently, but we need to build the bridges. A related question: how do we engage one another in our search to find ways to live out our free faith? We have been told by contemporary theologians and scholars that in our postmodern world, Unitarian Universalism is a religion that can succeed in bringing in younger generations, the spiritual but not religious, and the more liberal religious folks among us. But they're not joining us in great numbers. My experience with these groups is they are eager and willing to really engage in the work of theology, to dig deep to find the rituals and dialogues that can help us live out our faith, one that is not afraid to parse our differences and to explore the dimensions of the transcendent and immanent, and to explore where the Spirit is moving among us. And in this engagement, to love, to serve, to embrace life in joy on our different spiritual paths. But we too often do not have these dialogues and this engagement. Too often we can tend toward the insipid, fearing that such engagement might divide us. But rather, not doing this work keeps us small and not living up to the promise of our free faith. That great experiment, our great experiment, where people who believe differently come together to passionately experience living religiously. This, Douglas, is where I hear you calling us to zestfully live our UU faith and the promise it embodies. Whitehead claimed that religion is not about rules of safety, but is an adventure of the Spirit. The death of religion, he says, comes with the repression of the high hope of adventure. Would that we would approach our faith with that hope. This begs for me one last question. What stories and parables are we leaving for our children and our grandchildren? What passions do we share with them? You, Douglas, have pointed to some profound answers to this question. Connection in community, a healthy respect for our personal experience and where that can take us, the wonder of science, nature, tradition, evolution, and our part in all of this, leaning in toward one another, exploring our curiosity, being swaying trees in the winds of evolutionary change. How do we share all of this with our children if we cannot even share it with one another? How do we share the songs that move us and help our children find their songs? In this world where there is little trust, how do we help them find their source of love and in what they can and must trust? I remember Dorothy Sully, the post-war German theologian, who said, "To bless the children means to leave the trees standing for them. To bless the children means to leave those trees standing for them." I would add, the trees that uphold one another as the winds blow through. And thank you, Douglas, for blazing this path for us. So big.